Welcome, everyone, to today's session of Hot Topics in Nutrition Anti Inflammatory Diets, led by Isabelita Rosati. This program is hosted by the Blum Resource Center. Over at the Blum, we are grateful to the nutrition team for this continued partnership. The recording of this session will be posted on our Blum YouTube playlist and our Blum Digital Resource Center. For those of you watching live, if you have any questions related to today's program, please feel free to utilize the chat feature throughout the session. At the end of the session, your questions in the chat will be used to moderate our question and answer. If you have any other questions or like more information about resources and programs offered through the Blum, please visit our website at www.dana-farber.org/resource center or email us at blum_center@dfci.harvard.edu. Thank you all for joining us. I will now pass the workshop over to Isabelita.
Hi there, my name is Isabelita Rosati. I'm going to be talking today about anti-inflammatory diets and the impact of food on cancer and overall health. So first, what we'll talk about is what is inflammation. So inflammation is a normal part of your body's response to injuries and invaders. And it could be triggered by an infection or triggered by any kind of injury or trauma. It's actually helpful in that it helps resolve infections and it helps repair tissue and wounds. There are different symptoms or signs of inflammation, and some examples are here. So you might feel pain, you might feel heat, you might see redness or swelling or maybe loss of function. And this picture on the right is just, you don't need to know all the details, but basically there's a cascade of reactions that happen when you get injured that leads to inflammation and then eventually healing. Sometimes what can happen though is that inflammation can become dysregulated, and when it becomes dysregulated, it can cause damage in your entire body. And what can happen is your immune cells can produce these compounds called cytokines, which are pro-inflammatory, and they also produce these chemokines, and they trigger this immune response. Also, what can happen is these reactive oxygen species and nitrogen species and proteases. So there's all these different compounds that are produced that can lead to tissue damage. It can also lead to fibrosis, which is where the tissue hardens and scars due to inflammation. And this can lead to chronic inflammation. And what can happen is that this inflammation can play a key role in different diseases. So diseases such as diabetes, asthma, different cardiovascular diseases, and cancer. So in short, inflammation, your body does need it to heal from things, but when it becomes dysregulated, it can cause damage. So what are some symptoms of inflammation? So again, you may see swelling, heat, redness, or pain, and that's kind of acute inflammation when something happens. But then when you have chronic inflammation, people experience other things. So here are some other examples of chronic inflammation. You may feel pain in different areas. You may feel fatigue, insomnia, fever, mouth sores, diarrhea, constipation. A lot of vague things might happen, but it can lead to all these different symptoms. And then there's something called meta-inflammation. So meta-inflammation happens they've seen it happen with some of these Western style diets, and I'll go over what that is, but basically these Western diets tend to be very high in calories. And so here, where you have these high calorie diets and in a place where food is readily available, people sometimes tend to eat more than they need. And so these high calorie diets plus eating more than needed. And then if people are not active, it can kind of lead to this chronic inflammation. And this low grade chronic inflammation can also lead to disease development. And I've listed all these different diseases that can be related with this chronic metabolic inflammation. And there's increasing studies showing that this chronic inflammation can be causally linked to some of the leading health problems in the Western nations. So what is a Western diet? So the Western diet has also been referred to as the standard American diet. It's also been referred to as SAD, SAD, and it tends to be high in processed foods, tends to be high in saturated fats and carbohydrates. This is a list of a lot of the foods that tend to be associated with the standard American diet. So things like white bread, things like breakfast cereals, snacks, candies, cookies, ice cream, cakes, pizza, sausage, bacon, those kind of foods tend to be what is recognized as the Western diet. And the issue with the Western diet is that or some characteristics of the Western diet is that it tends to be high in refined sugars, salt, white flour, processed meats, animal fats, and food additives. And it also tends to be lower in fiber, vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants, tends to be very high in calories, and it tends to, what I've listed here is it exhibits a high glycemic index. So what that means is when you eat these foods, it tends to make your blood sugar rise very quickly. And when you have high calorie foods that make your blood sugars rise quickly, it causes your blood sugars just to spike. And then these nutrients get absorbed into the fat tissue, and this can promote weight gain quickly, more quickly than other balanced diets. And they're finding with different studies in mice and rats and human subjects that these Western diets are associated with different markers of inflammation. So what this suggests is that your immune system is starting to respond to these Western diets. And then what they're finding is that diet can actually influence these different stages of inflammation. So this is the same picture from before where you see injury happen and then inflammation, then healing. And there's this cascade of things that happen, but they're finding that different things that you eat in your diet can actually interfere with this cascade. So for example, polyphenols, it's a compound that's found in different plants. They found that it can have anti-inflammatory properties. So they found that these compounds that are found in different plants can actually interfere with some of this inflammation. And there's a lot of words here, but basically what happens is that they're finding that these plant compounds can kind of interfere with how the DNA is transcribed or copied over. And I talked earlier about the reactive oxygen species. And so I think you've heard probably of the term antioxidants. So when I talk about reactive oxidant species, it's similar to an oxidant is basically what I'm referring to. And so these antioxidants work against those harmful oxidants. And so what they can do is they can reduce the tissue damage that happens because the antioxidants that are in the plants kind of scavenge these free radicals in this cascade to decrease the formation. And then there have been studies in vitro and with animal models finding that these plant compounds have the ability to kind of slow down the development of some of these inflammatory diseases. And where are these polyphenols found? So basically they're found in fruits, vegetables, legumes, cocoa. Those are some sources of them. So flavonoid is a type of polyphenol, and it comes from the word flavus, meaning yellow. And they found these compounds to have effects on allergies, viruses, inflammation, and blood vessels. And again, these are found in fruits, vegetables, cocoa, tea, coffee. They found them to have these antioxidant effects. And so far, they have identified over 3,000 varieties. And there's different classes. So you may have heard some of these terms: flavanols, flavones, flavanones, flavanols, isoflavones, and anthocyanin. Those are just different terms for plant compounds. Interestingly, what they found is that these flavonoids have a similar mechanism to some of these pain-reducing drugs, so some of the NSAIDs, such as ibuprofen, aspirin, and naproxen. And they found that these flavonols have been able to kind of, again, interfere with how the cytokines are working. Now I'm going to flip over to DNA really quickly. So basically, This is a picture of DNA. And at the end are these things called telomeres. And the telomeres at the end protect or this is a picture of chromosome, part of a DNA. The end are these telomeres, and they protect these chromosomes from becoming frayed or tangled. And what they found is each time that a cell divides, the telomeres at the end get slightly shorter. And eventually they become so short that the cell will die. And so they're finding if you can keep these telomeres long, it helps to keep the cell alive and it helps with anti-aging. What they have found is that these flavonoids, so these plant compounds, can also have potential anti-cancer activity. And these researchers in India have studied some of these flavonols or flavonoids, and some of them I've listed here. And it has to do with keeping the telomere lengths long. One of these is called quercetin, and quercetin, they think, can help target that telomere, so help to spare the cell, and in this way can act as a potential anti-cancer agent. And just a quick thing about quercetin, and I promise you later in the talk it will become less technical, but just a little background. So it comes from a Latin word, and quercetin is not produced in the human body, but is one of the most bioavailable, one of my most widely used bioflavonoids to use to treat inflammatory disorders. And where do you find the quercetin? It's found in different fruits. So mainly citrus fruits. It's also found in green leafy vegetables, seeds, flowers, broccoli, apples. I've listed a whole lot of different fruits and vegetables where it's found. But they found that the highest concentrations tend to be in vegetables, such as onions and broccoli, also in fruits. And I've listed apples, cherries, berries, and then in drinks such as tea and red wine. And then there were some scientists from Michigan State, and they were studying the impact of flavonoids against inflammation. And they found that these flavonoids can reduce certain inflammatory markers. So sometimes when you have your blood tested, they'll check the CRP, which is a level of inflammation. And they have found that some of these foods helped decrease CRP. And they've also found it to decrease different other inflammatory markers. In rats, they've showed it to decrease arthritic activity. And so what is quercetin? So again, it can have these anti-cancer properties known to decrease growth of tumor in different cells. Some scientists studied the combination of curcumin, which is what's also found in turmeric, and quercetin. And they studied this, they gave it to subjects 3 times a day for 6 months and found that it reduced the size of these ileal and rectal adenomas in patients who have a kind of a predisposition to colon cancer. In rats, they found a beneficial effect against prostate cancer. And so what's quercetin? So quercetin is a flavanol. It's found mostly in fruits and vegetables, and it's the most common flavanol consumed in the human diet. And there are so many different sources, and there are many pictured here. So things like apples, peppers, red wine, cherries, berries, tomatoes. I won't list them all, but citrus fruits, cranberries, things like that. And then there's another compound called apigenin. It's another flavonoid that has potential to be health promoting. And it can potentially have anti-cancer properties in the different parts of the cascades. What they found is it also has a synergistic effect. So it can kind of enhance the effect of different drugs that are used for cancer treatment, such as paclitaxel or 5-FU. And apigenin is found in different things like parsley, spinach, celery, different forms of celery, dried oregano. It's found in rutabagas, oranges, kumquats, onions. But what they did find is that dried parsley has a very high level of apigenin, and also chamomile tea is another source. Isoflavones are another type of plant compound that could potentially be helpful. And so there were different studies done by researchers in Italy, the UK, Spain, and Poland. They did the kind of a search on all the databases of all the studies that were done up until June 2016. And what they found is that these isoflavones were significantly associated with decreased risk of lung and stomach cancers, as well as breast and colorectal cancers. And where can you find these isoflavones? They can be found in things like soybeans. Again, here's a list of different flavonoids and then different conditions where they may potentially have some effects. So just to kind of recap, flavonoids are these chemoprotective compounds that are found in plants. They are found in a wide variety of different fruits, vegetables, beans, dark chocolate for those who like chocolate. And what's interesting is that the different parts of the plants may have different levels of these flavonoids. So for example, the peel of like an orange may have more of these flavonoids than the inside of the orange. So sometimes when you use rinds in cooking, that might have higher flavonoids. And it works through these different methods. So it can scavenge these free radicals, and it can just work on different parts of the cell. Okay, and then these are just different kinds of flavonoids. So flavonols are found in green leafy vegetables. They're found in apples, onions, broccoli, and berries. Flavones are found in other leafy vegetables again, and herbs, as well as grains. Catechins are abundant in tea. So you may have heard when you hear that green tea may be good for you, it's these catechins that we're talking about with the green tea. They're also found in apples, grapes, chocolate, and red wine. And then flavonones are found in citrus fruits and their juices, and isoflavones are found in soybeans and soybeans products. So not that you need to remember which is related to what, but just knowing that getting a good variety of vegetables, fruits, herbs, tea, soy can be helpful. And again, this is just a list of the different classes of flavonoids along with the types and then the foods. So what's the most important to look at is just look at the foods on the right side. And again, it's a wide variety of fruits, vegetables, beans, and tea. And then this is just to kind of show they're doing some research on the anti-cancer properties of some of these plants, and just to show that some of these plants have similar structures to some of the anti-cancer drugs. So on the left, these are the compounds that are used that are found in the plants. And then on the right side, these are the compounds or what it looks like for some of the popular anti-cancer drugs that are used. And a lot of them have similar kind of structures. And then, so that's fruits and vegetables, but then what about nuts? So nuts can also be helpful. The thought behind nuts is that they can provide some antioxidant and anti-inflammatory protection. And what antioxidants are basically these we've talked about before, are these free radical scavengers that trap and neutralize these highly reactive molecules before they can damage cells. And then anti-inflammatory compounds can offer protection by reducing the formation of free radicals. So that's just kind of a background on antioxidants and anti-inflammatory. And then what you find with these nuts are these different kind of nuts can be high in these different types of antioxidants. So for example, alpha tocopherol is a form of vitamin D that's found in almonds and hazelnuts and pine nuts. And then these gamma tocopherols and tocotrienols are also forms of vitamin E, and studies suggest they may provide anti-inflammatory protection, but they're high in these nuts. Selenium is another antioxidant, and they're very high in Brazil nuts. It's found that one Brazil nut, and they're those big nuts when you get a container of mixed nuts, the big nuts, they supply about twice the daily recommended total of selenium. The one thing to be careful with Brazil nuts is just to be you don't want to have too many because 6 Brazil nuts every day can lead to toxicity. There's also a lot of talk about olive oil. There was a meta-analysis done where researchers looked at 45 different studies, and they found that people who consume the most olive oil were associated with a lower likelihood of different kind of cancers, including breast, GI, and urinary tract cancers. And this was found in both people that lived around the Mediterranean regions and that didn't live around the Mediterranean regions, just to suggest that high olive oil intake may signal an overall healthy diet pattern. It's part of the Mediterranean diet, which we will discuss in a minute. Another thing that you hear a lot about are omega-3 fats. And there was a study done by Patterson and his group, and they found that women with higher intakes of these omega-3 fats, and they're often the different kinds of fats are EPA and DHA. They found that the women with higher intakes of these fats had reduced risk for breast cancer events as compared with the women with the lowest intake. What was interesting is they found this people who consumed fish, but not fish oil supplements. So it was the omega-3 fats from foods, but not from the supplements. Okay, so we're just going to switch over to the different kind of anti-inflammatory diets that you hear about. So when we say anti-inflammatory diets, it's not a very specific single diet. It's kind of a different kinds of foods that go towards this diet. But I'm going to talk about different diets that have been advised in the past. So first, the DASH diet. So the DASH diet was devised to stop hypertension, so blood pressure. A lot of times if you have high blood pressure, doctors may put you on a low sodium diet. So this DASH diet, it stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. One of the key parts of it is that it is low sodium, so there's a sodium restriction on it. But then if you look on the left side of this picture here, with the DASH diet, they want you to eat more vegetables, fruits, whole grains, low-fat dairy, fish, poultry, so chicken, turkey, beans, nuts, and seeds. And they want you to limit things like fatty meats, full-fat dairy, sweetened drinks, sweets, and then the salt. So that's part of the DASH diet. And then there's a lot of talk now also about the Mediterranean diet. And one of the key things of the Mediterranean diet is it's high in kind of more natural, unprocessed ingredients. Mediterranean diet has a lot of fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, fish. And what's one of the key things is they use olive oil as the main fat. And so I just talked about how olive oil may have, some benefit in reducing risk of different cancers. There are different trials that show that the Mediterranean diet is associated with reduced cardiovascular risk. And then there was a study showing that supplementation with extra virgin olive oil, EVOO, or nuts, in addition to consultations with people on how to adhere to this diet, can reduce the occurrence of cardiovascular events, including heart attack or stroke, by up to 30%. They've also found that consumption of Mediterranean diet is also negatively correlated with some of these inflammation markers. So people that eat more closely to the Mediterranean diet have lower amounts of these inflammation markers when blood tested. So what is the Mediterranean diet? So again, it's similar to the DASH diet where it's lots of vegetables, fruits, beans, lentils, and nuts. They want you to eat these at every meal. It is using olive oil as the main oil for cooking, and then including fish at least 3 times a week, because these fish are high in these omega-3 fatty acids. It includes a moderate amount of cheese and yogurt, and then meat is used very sparingly, but poultry is part of it. And then in the Mediterranean, they say to use a moderate amount of wine with meals. So typically what that means is about a drink for women, up to 2 for men. But if you don't drink now, not to start necessarily. And then there is another diet that was devised, and it was the combination of the Mediterranean plus the DASH diet. And they found that combining the DASH diet, which was the one for heart health, plus the Mediterranean diet. So M is for Mediterranean, intervention for neurodegenerative delay. So this was devised for brain health. And what they did is they devised this score where they rated these different foods with different number of points. And the whole grains, vegetables, green leafy vegetables, berries, beans tended to have higher points than other foods. And they found that people that ate these foods that had the higher mind diet score tended to have better outcomes in terms of brain health. So what are we suggesting here? So what we're looking at is if you look at the hand on the left, that's those are kind of the hallmarks of the standard American diet. So things that are tend to be made of white flour, kind of more processed meats. Going from this pattern of eating more over to the one on the right. So one that includes more fruits, vegetables, nuts, whole grains, can be beneficial. And again, so when we talk about anti-inflammatory diet, whether it is DASH or Mediterranean or MIND, um, whatever you want to follow, the kind of the base of all of them are that they tend to be high in fruits and vegetables. They tend to include beans, nuts, and seeds. They tend to be high in fiber. They tend to be high in phytonutrients. So these plant compounds that we talked about, just in, easier terms, you want to eat different fruits and vegetables that have all different colors. So things that are red, orange, yellow, green. You may heard of eating the rainbow or trying to eat your colors. So just trying to eat all different colors. It just helps to get all those different phytonutrients, those different phytochemicals into your diet. And then using the healthy fats. So things like olive oil, eating fatty fish, like salmon and mackerel, and then the omega-3s that are also found in walnuts and flax seeds can be beneficial. And on the right side are just some tips how to get more into your diet. So, for example, switching from white bread to things like whole wheat bread might be helpful to get some of these more fiber into your diet. We often talk about filling half of your plate with vegetables or fruit at meals, maybe throwing some nuts on a salad, things like that. Again, some foods that fight inflammation are things like tomatoes, fruits, nuts, olive oil, leafy greens, and fatty fish. This picture is from Harvard Health. And then foods that could promote inflammation. So just to minimize are things like the fried foods, refined breads, processed meats. The American Institute for Cancer Research has come out with what they call the New American Plate. And what that is basically it's the third plate from the left. This is kind of the goal of what we are aiming to achieve. So if you look at the old American plate, you have a piece of red meat that takes up about a third of the plate. It's like a big portion of red meat. And ideally, what you want to do is transition to where you're using a leaner protein. So more often, so something like chicken or fish or turkey or tofu, something like that. You want to make the fruit and vegetable portion a lot bigger. And what we see on the old American plate, so you have potatoes, which is carbohydrate, and you want to eventually make that a little bit smaller. And then you want the peas, which are a vegetable, but they're a starchy vegetable. You want to kind of transition over to some vegetables that are not as starchy. So not to say that there's anything wrong with peas, but to try to include more non-starchy vegetables and fruit in your meals. And so you start with this old American plate where you have a big portion of red meat and some starchy peas and some starchy potatoes. You transition over to where you have maybe green beans, which tend to be a little less starchy, smaller meat, and then transition over to the New American Plate, where the goal is to have about half of your plate be fruits and vegetables. You see here that there's a whole grain there for the starch. Looks like quinoa or brown rice there, and then maybe chicken. And it doesn't have to look like this every time. It could look like something like stir fry where it's all mixed together. It can look like, something in different forms, but that idea where you have about half your plate be fruits and vegetables to get all those phytochemicals in, and then to get the lean proteins in and the whole grains. That's the goal. And so that's basically it. And do you have any questions?
Thank you so much, Isabelita. I don't see any questions right now. The only question in the Q&A was if the presentation will be shared. It will be shared. You can access it by going to our Digital Resource Center. I can drop the link chat as well, but in a few days it should be uploaded. There was one comment just thanking you and saying it was fantastic, which it
Oh,
absolutely
great.
was. So thank you so much for that comprehensive program on anti-inflammatory diets, and we appreciate your time. Thanks for sharing with us.
Thank you. And I've put my references at the end if anyone is interested.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Thank you for joining us.